There was no warning, no announcement in the morning papers, no gathering of grieving staff or city officials, just silence. On March 3, 1921, the doors of Mercy General Hospital were locked from the inside, and they were never opened again. The building sat quietly in the heart of Grayson, Illinois, a grand gray brick institution with iron-barred windows and a chapel that never held weddings. That morning, delivery drivers found crates of medical supplies piled on the front steps, still marked for surgery wings that no longer responded to knocks. One of them peered through the side window and saw a single gurney in the hall, its wheels turned sideways like someone had run from it. That was all it took. By noon, the police arrived, but when they forced the doors open, what they found inside didn't match any official evacuation protocol. In fact, it didn't match anything at all. The lights were still on. Soft gas lamps flickered in patient rooms where no patients were found. In the main surgical theater, an operation tray lay beside an open chest cavity. The body on the table long gone, but a line of red still traced the floor like someone had dragged the wound itself away. Cabinets were open, charts left mid-sentence, and coffee cups half full and cooling beside medical journals bookmarked with scalpels. Nothing had been cleaned, but nothing had been looted either. It was as if the building had exhaled every living thing it held in a single night. Then someone noticed the names. On the staff board in the East Wing, 15 brass placards were missing. 15 doctors. Gone. No resignations. No deaths reported, not a single forwarding address, just absence. An investigation was launched, but none of it made the papers. Not the burnt medical files in the furnace room, not the basement door chained shut from the inside. Not even the wax-sealed envelope found beneath the chapel pews, addressed to no one, containing only a single line written in blood. The body remembers what mercy forgets. Behind closed doors, officials called it a complete failure of institutional oversight. But behind that, in rooms where silence was safer, they called it something else. They called it a sanctuary for doctors who weren't doctors anymore. Years later, when the final report was leaked, it was redacted into nothing. All that remained was the date, the list of missing personnel, and the final incident summary. Facility deemed structurally unsound, permanent closure ordered. But the walls of Mercy General didn't fall. They stayed standing, for decades, until the building was quietly demolished in 1969 under the guise of urban renewal. No press release then either. Only a warning to workers to avoid touching anything sealed in white cloth. No one asked what that meant. This is not a story about what happened to the patients. Not yet. It is not a story about a haunted hospital or a chemical spill or a war-era cover-up. It is a story about the minds behind the doors, the men and women who practiced medicine without conscience, not with hate or madness, but with order, with method, with faith. This is a story about the 15 doctors who disappeared, not as monsters, but as believers in a different kind of healing. Not one of them confessed. Not one of them was ever found. Only their tools remained, and the silence they left behind. And if you listen closely, that silence still holds breath. Dr. Abel Klemper was not the kind of man people feared. He wore ivory gloves in the surgical theater not because he had to, but because they calmed the patients. He smiled when he greeted them, used their first names with soft familiarity, and kept a pocket watch that ticked just loud enough to anchor the anxious. On paper, he was a savior. The youngest chief physician Mercy General had ever hired, fluent in 6 languages and known among his peers for his mastery of nerve pathways and cortical incisions. His lectures drew packed rooms. Students described him as magnetic. But underneath that charm was something harder to see. Not darkness, but hunger. Abel was not driven by power, cruelty, or money. What drove him was something colder, a belief that the soul had a border and that death was not an ending, but a wall, one that could be found, touched, and measured. He called his work soul threshold mapping, and no one stopped him. He was born in 1883 in a Bavarian orphanage not listed on any registry and raised in a church that treated silence as scripture. At age 9, he dissected a crow to watch its heart stop and wrote down the exact second its wings twitched for the last time. At 13, he was recruited by a field medic working with post-war trauma cases, and by 17, he was assisting experimental surgeons who had lost their licenses long before he ever wore a white coat. These men taught him things that books never printed: how to extract a tooth through the nasal cavity, how to keep a patient's brain alive after spinal detachment, and how to open a person's chest in silence so they would never scream. Abel didn't recoil. He recorded. Page after page, diagram after diagram, he built his theory. That pain was the map, and death was a doorway. When he arrived at Mercy General in 1917, the board welcomed him as a war hero with modern European methods. They gave him the entire West Wing. No restrictions, no oversight. His credentials were flawless. But no one noticed the details: that his university dissertation was missing from records, that none of his references responded to letters, that the medical instruments he brought with him, though polished and perfect, had no manufacturer. And no one asked why his patients never received flowers or visitors or discharge papers. Abel said they were part of a long-term neurological study on the effects of deep coma states. He called it compassionate research. The board called it progress. Inside his office, locked behind reinforced glass and an old confessional screen, Abel kept shelves of what he called samples. Not tissue, not bone, but emotions. Small, sealed jars filled with fluid he claimed contained grief, shame, or love. He believed the brain could secrete remnants of the soul if shocked at the moment of near death. So he built machines to do just that. Devices that pulsed light into the retina while the heart was slowed chemically, forcing the patient to linger briefly between life and what came after. He called this place the threshold, and he believed if he could hold someone there long enough, they would speak what only the dead could know. He kept notes on everything they said. The words that made no sense, the phrases that seemed ancient, and the patterns of sounds that repeated across subjects. One patient, a child no older than 9, whispered a word in a dead dialect of Latin that hadn't been spoken since the 3rd century. Abel smiled when he heard it. He said it matched the word found scratched into a 700-year-old plague tomb he once studied in silence, alone, in the dead of winter. But what made Abel truly dangerous was not his belief in death. It was his belief in mercy. He thought what he was doing was kind. That truth, even if carved, was a gift. That the soul wanted to be seen and suffering was the only lens clear enough to glimpse it. He designed procedures that felt more like rituals than operations. Rooms bathed in candlelight, patients bound in precise positions based on old anatomical diagrams, surgical incisions that followed the golden ratio of facial symmetry. Every action, no matter how brutal, was mathematically justified. His methods were clean, but his purpose was not. He was not saving lives. He was arranging deaths in ways that made sense to him, as if life was just an illness to be organized, and death was the cure he needed to study up close. For 4 years, no one stopped him. His success rate on standard procedures kept the board distracted. His charm kept the staff quiet, and his belief, cold, beautiful, complete, kept him moving deeper into the work. By 1921, he was no longer keeping medical records. He was writing scripture. The pages he filled were not patient notes. They were prayers, written backward, soaked in the ink of embalming fluid, stored in books bound with unknown skin. He spoke less to the living and more to the machines he built. He once told a nurse that every organ sings when it dies, but only the most loyal ears will ever hear it. Then he smiled and adjusted her gloves. When Mercy General shut down, his name was at the top of the missing list, but his body was never found. Only one thing was left in his office, his pocket watch, still ticking, placed neatly on an empty surgery tray beside a page marked with 2 words. Threshold reached, and whatever came after him and whatever grew from that silence did not end when the doors closed. It waited, because men like Abel Klemper do not die. They vanish into the work. There was no official record of room B-17 ever existing in Mercy General's floor plans. It sat behind the Eastern Surgical Annex, sealed behind a steel wall and labeled only as storage. But buried in the blueprints found years later, faint beneath red ink corrections and staff approvals, was a diagram, one circle inside another. A chamber lined with gas valves and a narrow chair bolted to the floor. Above it the words, Pulmonary Ritual Chamber, Phase 1. That room was not designed for healing. It was made to listen, and the first voice it heard belonged to a woman named Eleanor Meyer. Eleanor was 34 when she was admitted and diagnosed with acute asthma and recurring respiratory failure. Her file listed no family, no prior admissions, and no known allergies. But her intake photo told a different story. Wide, dark eyes and a neck that bore the marks of long-term restraint. She wasn't ill. She was chosen. A nurse's hidden journal described Eleanor as calm, obedient, unnaturally still. She asked no questions and followed orders before they were given. Her blood work was noted to be oxygen-dense, a phrase that appears nowhere in modern medical terminology. She was not placed in recovery. She was transferred. Not to a ward, but to the sealed room. No bed, just that narrow chair, just the circle. The operation was unlike anything the hospital had documented. Her lungs were removed in full, not collapsed, not bypassed, but extracted, each in a single intact piece. What replaced them was not synthetic or organic. It was blown glass. Twin vessels shaped like real lungs, clear as ice, filled with a gold-colored serum whose chemical makeup has never been identified. These glass lungs did not inflate on their own. They responded only to sound. Eleanor had to speak to breathe. Her words, even whispers, would vibrate the chamber's sealed interior, keeping the serum in motion. If she paused for more than 7 seconds, the mixture thickened. If she stopped for longer, the pressure built until the glass imploded inward, a silent rupture designed to kill only once. The room was filled with sulfur gas during the procedure, not as anesthesia, but as preservation. Abel Klemper believed that sulfur trapped the soul in its final breath. The air was poisoned by design, forcing Eleanor to rely fully on the prosthetic system. A dictaphone was hidden in the wall, set to record everything she said. What began as fragments, memories, names, dates, slowly changed. Over the first 3 days, her voice grew distant, slowed, and foreign. She began to speak in patterns, not thoughts. She counted backwards. She recited biblical passages that no one taught her. She repeated one phrase over and over in the final hours. I must stay heard. I must stay heard. On the 4th day, her voice stopped, not with panic, not with pain, just a simple word spoken once, clear and cold. Unwitnessed, then silence, and within seconds a pop, sharp, clean, final. The glass collapsed inward, driving shards into her chest cavity. Her heart stopped not from blood loss, but suffocation. The serum congealed instantly, clotting the throat before a scream could rise. When they found her, her face was frozen in peace. her mouth slightly opened, as if waiting for permission to speak again. The recording survived. No one knows who preserved it or how it was kept hidden for so long. It was found decades later in an old filing cabinet sealed with wire labeled Case 1, Auditory Transfer. The audio is faint, hollow, but the final word is unmistakable, unwitnessed. It plays on repeat, then clicks to silence. No follow-up tests were ever confirmed. But notes from another surgeon list 2 more patient files marked with a symbol, an hourglass drawn in blood. Each had lung conditions. Each died within 72 hours. Their charts vanished the same night the East Wing was shuttered. Abel called this his ritual of containment, not of the body, but of the soul's final sound. And it was only the beginning. There was something wrong with 2 a.m. at Mercy General. Not midnight, not the dead of night, but exactly 2 down to the second. Nurses spoke of it in low voices like it was a superstition they didn't believe but still feared. The lights in the West Wing would dim but not go out, just enough to cast long, moving shadows across the floor, like something was crawling just beneath the surface. Gurneys were seen rolling through the halls without escort. The logs showed no patient transfers and no scheduled surgeries. Just movement. Quiet wheels turning, doors opening on their own, and the smell of antiseptic growing strong enough to sting the eyes. Most nurses who worked the shift requested reassignment within a few weeks. Some just walked out mid-round and never came back. But one stayed longer than the rest, Lydia Kane. Nurse Kane had arrived at Mercy General fresh from the warfield. Calm under pressure, disciplined, unshaken. She wasn't one for ghost stories or rumors. Her file described her as emotionally flat, detail-orientated, and with a high tolerance for trauma. Which is why Dr. Klemper personally assigned her to the 2 a.m. rotation. A quiet shift, he said, for someone who didn't mind solitude. At first, Lydia thought the unease was just in her head. The flickering lights could have been faulty wiring. The soft metallic scraping could have been old beds settling. But by the second week, the patterns began. Always at 2:03, the call lights would blink in 3 rooms, 12B, 17A, and 19C, all of them long condemned. She once went to check out of habit. She found nothing inside, no patients, no furniture, just handprints. Small ones, like a child's, pressed into the dust on the floor, leading straight to the drain. Lydia began keeping a log, not words, not events, but numbers. Every night she wrote exact timestamps down to the second, when the air changed, when the silence became pressure, when she heard breathing that wasn't hers. The pages were later found rolled tight inside her thermos, hidden from staff. The numbers had no explanations beside them, just long rows of decimals and lines that dipped like heart monitors. In one section, every third line ended with a number 7. On the last page, no numbers at all, only the word below. During her 6th week on the shift, Lydia lost her vision. It happened at 2:08 a.m. Witnesses said she was standing in the hallway, frozen in place, staring into the flickering light. She didn't scream. She didn't blink. She just fell to her knees and whispered. The dark went inside. Her corneas were found to be scorched, not by heat but by something the doctor called optic trauma consistent with blast exposure. But there had been no explosion. Only silence. When asked later, Lydia would describe the moment not as blindness but as replacement. She said something burnt the world out of her eyes and left only movement, not shapes or color, just a pulsing rhythm like veins tightening in the walls. She spoke of hearing screams from beneath the floor, not muffled but sharp and timed like they were part of a test. She said they weren't screams of pain but of release, like someone had been holding them in for years. The hospital deemed her unstable and transferred her to a private facility. Her notebook was locked away in the archives. until it was found again, hidden inside a broken wall panel after the demolition. The ink hadn't faded, neither had the timestamps. And in the final margin, someone, maybe Lydia, maybe someone after her, had written one more number. 2:11. The only minute the West Wing was ever truly silent. But no one who worked the shift ever stayed long enough to hear what happened next. Buried 3 levels below the main operating floor of Mercy General was a chamber no one admitted building. It wasn't on the blueprints, wasn't in the renovation orders, and wasn't acknowledged by the hospital board. But it was real. The entrance sat behind a linen closet with no doorknob, a panel that opened only if you pressed your hand against a small square of smooth wax embedded in the wall. It led to a stairwell lit by a single red bulb, and at the bottom of that stairwell was the place Dr. Marcel Fontaine called the Chamber of Echoes. Fontaine had been a sound surgeon. Not officially, there was no such title, but that's what the nurses called him. He believed trauma wasn't just emotional or psychological. He believed it was sonic, that pain stored inside the body like a low hum, always vibrating just under the skin, too quiet to hear unless you knew how to listen. And he believed it could be extracted. The chamber was his instrument. The walls were lined with alternating layers of human bone, sculpted wax, and hundreds of strands of piano wire strung from floor to ceiling. Each strand was tuned by hand, tightened until it vibrated at specific frequencies associated with emotional response: fear, shame, rage, despair. Fontaine had conducted years of tests on cadavers before ever inviting a living subject into the room. He found that even in death, certain frequencies could make the eyes twitch or the throat clench, as if the nerves were still remembering. But what he wanted was not reflex. He wanted release. Patients brought to the chamber were never informed. They were told it was an auditory sensitivity assessment, that it would help with migraines or post-operative hallucinations. Once seated in the center of the room, they were strapped to a chair molded to fit the curve of the spine and jaw, forcing the mouth slightly open. A small metal tube was inserted into the ear canal. The procedure began with a low pulse, barely audible. Then the wires would begin to sing, not all at once, but in stages. Each vibration struck a specific point in the nervous system, and within minutes the patient would begin to recall memories not triggered by thought but by sensation. The past was not revisited, it was refelt, and what came out was not words, it was sound. The human voice, when cracked open by fear, changes shape. Fontaine recorded it obsessively: cries, gasps, stuttering breaths, but most importantly, the screams that didn't start from pain but from realization. That moment when the patient understood where they were, what had been taken from them and what had been exposed. He called that moment the crescendo. Each session ended with the same ritual. A long breath, a closing of the patient's eyes, and a thick stream of saliva dripping from the jaw to the floor as the muscles seized. Some passed out, some begged to stay. None returned unchanged. In the corner of the chamber there were shelves lined with jars, each labeled like a musical composition: Concerto in Shame, Number 3, Elegy for the Father's Belt, Untitled, Sibling, Repeated Event. Inside each jar was a small vial of clear liquid drawn from the subject's spinal fluid post-session. Fontaine claimed it contained emotional sediment, molecular residue from the trauma being expressed. He never explained how he extracted it. But his notes show chemical shifts in the fluid after each session: higher acidity, protein spikes, subtle changes in color. Some of the vials had faint pink swirls like a fingerprint left in water. After 5 or 6 sessions, the patients began to change, not just mentally but physically. Hair turned gray, skin thinned. One man's teeth fell out. They aged as if memory was a poison being pulled to the surface too quickly. Fontaine recorded this as accelerated nostalgia decay, a syndrome he believed came from the body resisting exposure to its own past. Most patients didn't die. They just stopped speaking. Not from trauma, but from exhaustion. As if they had said everything the body could possibly say, and now there was nothing left to give. When the hospital was shut down, the chamber was sealed with cement and forgotten. But 2 years later, a construction crew working nearby reported hearing what they described as strings being plucked beneath the floor during demolition. Nothing was found. But a jar was recovered, buried in the rubble, unbroken, still labeled in Fontaine's handwriting. Fugue in Child Guilt solo version. Inside, the fluid was black, thick, still moving. And if held to the ear, they said, it hummed. Not loud, just enough to remind whoever listened that pain, when given the right frequency, never truly stops. It just waits to be heard again. It wasn't found in a drawer or a file room. It was hidden in the wall, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed behind layers of plaster and wooden paneling, as if someone wanted it buried but not destroyed. The crew found it by accident while removing old piping from the south dormitory wing of the Mercy General ruins. A leather-bound ledger, thick and brittle, its pages curled at the edges, marked only with a single name in the front. Property of Dr. A. Klemper. No title, no cover. No sign it ever belonged in the official records. Inside were the names of 113 children. No birth certificates, no parent names, no adoption trails, just first names, ages, blood types. And in the rightmost column, one word stamped in red ink beside each, acquired. The earliest entries dated back to 1918. The youngest child listed was 3 months old. Most were between 5 and 12. None were sick, at least not in ways that required hospitalization. Notes under their intake reasons included strange phrases like stillness unbroken, excess emotional retention, and dreams consistent with somatic inversion. Some had blank spaces where diagnoses should have gone. Instead, there were symbols. Circles with dots in the center, triangle shapes in pairs. A few were marked with an hourglass. But what stood out most was the pattern in their blood types. All negative, every single one. Mostly O negative, some AB negative. Types that were, even then, rare. Hard to match, harder to find. Dr. Klemper had circled each one with heavy black ink, and beside them he wrote a word not found in any medical journal. Proximity. The intake locations were vague. Donation from Arkham Shelter. Transit via Southport Orphanage. Delivered by clergy. None of these institutions could be traced in any surviving registry. No transfer receipts, no signatures, just dates and arrival times, always around 3 a.m., always through the loading bay used for laundry deliveries. The children were placed in Ward 9, which was later walled off after a fire no one filed a report for. The few surviving photos from that ward show narrow beds with iron restraints and dolls nailed to the walls, not laid out for comfort but posed like warnings. A faded photo paper clipped into the back of the ledger showed 2 twin girls standing on either side of a scale, blindfolded, holding each other's hands. Only one of them is smiling. Twins appeared again and again in the ledger, always separated, never housed together. Each twin was tested for a metric called mirror deviation. In the margins, Klemperer had drawn sketches of spinal curvature and skull pressure points, labeling one twin as signal and the other as anchor. No explanation. Only arrows pointing to what he called ritual thresholds of the blood. His notes suggested that negative Rh blood types were not a condition but a marker. Something passed down through what he referred to as pre-temporal lineage. A lineage that he claimed bypassed ordinary inheritance. He believed these children were biologically tuned to reach a place others could not. a place he never fully named, only hinted at, below the breath, beyond the womb. That phrase appeared 3 times. There are no discharge papers for any of the 113 children, no death certificates. But on the final page, 27 names are crossed out with thick red lines. Next to them in faded pencil, the word unresponsive is written. The remaining names are simply left as they are, untouched, as if waiting for a result that never came. Some of the jars in Dr. Fontaine's chamber bear initials matching the children's entries. Others are marked with numbers that mirror the intake dates. It is believed that some were used in auditory trauma studies. Others in blood resonance tests. One name, Elijah B., appears in 5 different chapters of Klemperer's personal notebooks, each time followed by the word delayed. No details, just that single word circled again and again, growing darker with each entry. No one ever came looking for these children. No missing persons reports matched their names. As if they were chosen not from the world but from its edges, quiet places where silence was easy to ignore. Klemperer's own theory was simple. Purity did not mean innocence. It meant closeness to whatever came before life. He believed these children were not victims but vessels. And when the hospital fell silent in 1921, so did every voice tied to their names. Only the ledger remained, waiting behind a wall, as if to remind someone, anyone, that they were real, and that they had been taken, quietly, on purpose, by hands that believed it was mercy. It was never marked on the blueprints, not even in pencil. No plumbing, no wiring, no architectural trace. Just a thick concrete wall behind the mortuary with no handles, no seams, and no obvious purpose. But behind it, through a panel that slid sideways when enough pressure was applied, sat a room colder than anything else in the hospital. No lighting, no insulation. Just cold. Deliberate, measured cold, kept at exactly -3 degrees Celsius at all times. The cold room, as it came to be called, was never meant to store corpses. It was meant for the living. The walls were metal, lined with a dull gray coating that collected moisture like breath on a window. The center of the room held 12 chairs arranged in a perfect circle, each one bolted to the floor and fitted with thin leather straps on the arms and ankles. They weren't restraints in the usual sense. They were too delicate for that. These weren't for panic. These were for stillness. Each chair had a name scratched into the metal backrest, not engraved but clawed in, crooked and uneven as if by someone whose fingers had forgotten how to hold a pen. The names didn't match any staff or patient records. Many had no last names at all, just first names, or letters or numbers. Some repeated, others were crossed out. The cold wasn't incidental, that was the point. Dr. Abel Klemper believed that warmth lied, that the body, when held in comfort, protected itself with false memory, with illusions of selfhood, pride, and emotion. But in the cold, the nervous system changed. The blood slowed. The muscles betrayed themselves, and something older, something he called the original self, was exposed. A former janitor, now blind and nearly 90, spoke once in an interview that was never aired. He said his job was to wheel bodies down the hallway after hours. Not corpses, patients. Still breathing, still moving, wrapped in thin cloth, barefoot, always silent. He said he wasn't allowed to speak to them. He was told the cold would do the listening. Inside the cold room, patients were seated for exactly 66 minutes. No more, no less. During that time, no one was allowed to enter. No one was to observe. Only a thin slit in the wall allowed a dictaphone to record the sounds inside. These recordings, now mostly erased or lost, captured not screams but shivering gasps, long stretches of humming, and whispers in unrecognized languages. One tape reportedly contained a full conversation between two voices, though only one person was ever inside. The janitor remembered the smell after each session. "Not like blood," he said. "Not like anything human. More like something that had been pulled from under frozen soil." One man survived. His name was Thomas Baird. He was a groundskeeper assigned to basement repairs, mistakenly taken one night after a nurse misread his ID badge. They kept him in the room for 71 minutes. When they opened the door, he was shaking violently, hands torn, eyes wide, jaw locked. He had clawed at the chair until the metal bent. He had ripped his own name from the back of the seat. With his fingernails, he scratched it off until nothing was left. They found the shreds of his own skin beneath him. When asked later why he did it, he whispered, "That name wasn't mine, not anymore." After the shutdown of Mercy General, the cold room was filled with cement and sealed by order of the demolition team. But they were never told what had been in it. The lead contractor only remembered that the temperature inside didn't rise for hours after the walls came down, and long after the power had been cut, the thermometer still read -3. The same cold, the same silence, and somewhere beneath the concrete, 12 chairs remain, some with names still waiting to be scratched away. It was buried deep beneath the altar in the chapel of Mercy General. Not shelved, not hidden in a drawer, but entombed, wrapped in gauze, sealed in wax, and stuffed inside the hollow base of the marble cross that hung crooked over the pews. The manuscript had no cover, only a torn linen band wrapped tight around its center like a wound. When it was opened years later during demolition, it smelt faintly of iron and mildew, as if it had been soaked not in water, but in something more human. The pages, thin and yellowed, were marked with blotches that forensics would later confirm were blood and bile. It was not a medical journal, not research, not even a confession. It was scripture, handwritten, deliberate, and deeply unsettling. Its title, scrawled in uneven letters on the first page, read simply, "The Hollow Doctrine." The manuscript was written entirely by Dr. Abel Klemperer in the final months before Mercy General closed. But this was not the Klemperer who spoke in clean Latin phrases or smiled politely through staff briefings. This was something else, something no longer pretending to be part of science. He described the human body not as an organism but as a structure, a cathedral built around silence. He wrote that healing was a myth, that every form of care only postponed the body's one sacred function, collapse. According to him, pain was not a symptom, it was a prayer. He called surgical blades keys and incisions windows. Each part of the body held a hidden message, but only at the point of death did it speak clearly. His experiments, he claimed, were not to cure, they were to listen. Scattered through the pages were hand-drawn diagrams of patients positioned like crucifixes. Arms outstretched, legs bound, chests opened along geometric lines. But they weren't laid out for surgery. They were arranged like offerings. Each sketch was labeled with a single phrase, threshold configuration. He noted how certain cuts made the heart slow in rhythm with Gregorian chants played on phonographs. He observed that livers released a faint pulse of heat when the patient recalled deep shame. He believed every organ had a voice, one too old for language, one that could only be heard during structured death. The manuscript didn't shy away from cruelty. In fact, it framed cruelty as devotion. Klemperer wrote that blood was the only honest ink and that suffering clarified the body's design the way fire clarifies metal. In one passage, he claimed to have witnessed what he called a divine echo, a moment during a failed experiment when a patient's final breath slowed into something that resembled speech not formed in the mouth, but through the vibration of exposed nerves. He wrote that the sound was not meant for the living, that it cracked the glass in his instruments and caused 3 other patients in nearby rooms to seize at once. He called it the sound of something watching back, something inside the body, not spiritual, not metaphorical, but anatomical, something buried beneath the spine, something that waited. The final paragraph of the manuscript is written in darker ink, the lines heavy, some of the letters trembling. He writes, "We were never healing them. We were listening to them die, to hear what God would say when it finally stopped." The page ends there with no signature, no closing, just a blot of ink that trails off the bottom like his hand slipped. What's most disturbing is that this was not hidden from guilt or shame. It was hidden as if it were sacred, protected, buried beneath a chapel where prayer once echoed against stone walls and where no one thought to look for a surgeon's gospel. After the manuscript was uncovered, it was sealed and archived under government order, but copies were made, quietly, passed between officials who could not explain the symbols drawn in the margins, symbols that matched carvings found in the sub-basement and even older ones etched into the scalpels discovered in Dr. Fontaine's chamber. Klemperer's doctrine was not an idea, it was a plan, a belief system carved into flesh. And if what he wrote was true, that the body was a cathedral and death the key, then every patient that passed through Mercy General wasn't a victim. They were a door. And the doctors weren't madmen. They were locksmiths, waiting for silence to finally speak. There were patients who left Mercy General, not many and never through the front doors, but some were released, cleared as stable, discharged with silence. They tried to move on, new cities, new names, but the past, whatever it truly was inside those walls, did not let go. Some began to feel it in their sleep, that cold vibration beneath the skin, a low hum where stitches once were. Others felt it when they were alone, when no sound should have existed. But the worst were the ones who didn't just feel it, they heard it, the voice of their scar. A sound that didn't come from the throat but from the wound. And it always said the same thing, "Come back." Judith Halberd was admitted to Mercy General in 1919 for what the records call nervous hysteria and extreme spinal tension. She had seizures. Unexplained numbness, a sharp pressure in her lower back that no one could fix. Until she was referred to the West Wing. That was where they did the real procedures. She remembered being strapped down, the lights too dim to see clearly, and the hands working on her body not speaking a word. She remembered the cold clamp of metal at the base of her spine and the feeling of her vocal cords tightening, even though no one was near her throat. When she awoke, the seizures were gone, the pain was gone. But something new had taken its place. When she touched people, she sang, not songs, not language, a pure, painful pitch that spilt from her mouth whenever she placed her hand on another human being. It wasn't voluntary, it wasn't even hers. The sound changed depending on who she touched. Some tones were low and full of weight, like grief wrapped in concrete. Others were sharp and high, like the snap of bone or the moment breath leaves a body. Each time she sang, her back ached, the scar pulling tight as if it were trying to reopen. And worse, the people she touched felt it too. Some wept without knowing why. Others backed away, terrified, unable to explain what had been taken from them, or what had been given back. She became a nun 3 years after her release. The order accepted her without question, perhaps sensing something holy or haunted behind her quiet eyes. She never sang during prayer, only when she was alone, only when the scar ached too much to bear. In the convent, she kept a razor beside her bed. Every night she reopened the scar at her spine with shaking hands, just deep enough to make the voice go silent. Not out of hate, but out of duty. She believed the voice didn't belong in this world, that it was meant for a moment between moments, and that her body had been turned into a vessel without her consent. She wrote only one testimonial in a letter sent to a priest who once worked at the hospital's chapel. The letter was never mailed. It was found tucked inside her Bible after her death. It read, "Every person I touch sings the pain they forgot. I hear their suffering like a hymn. I think this is what confession is, but it's not mine to carry." She died without scars on her hands, but the one on her back had grown wider and more jagged, as if something beneath the skin had tried one last time to speak. She was not the only one. Records show that 6 other former patients returned to Mercy General in the weeks before its closure, not for treatment, not for vengeance, but to be near the place where their wounds first began to sing. And none of them was ever seen again. Behind the crumbling greenhouse at Mercy General was a stretch of earth that shouldn't have grown anything. It was too close to the furnace room. The soil was ash-gray, heavy and dry, layered with the fine remains of patients who had been cremated without documentation. The greenhouse itself had long since fallen into disuse. Glass panels shattered, metal frame rusted, vines cracking through the walls from the outside. But it wasn't the greenhouse that mattered. It was what grew behind it. A garden, if you could call it that. Wild and silent. But when examined closely, the plants told a story far stranger than anything that grew from light or rain. Dr. Eshon Meyer was not a surgeon nor a therapist. He was listed in the hospital records as a botanical specialist, assigned to develop calming green environments for long-term patients. He maintained the greenhouse and kept to himself. His office smelt of formaldehyde and rotting bark. To most, he was harmless, gentle. But in his private logs, which were discovered decades later in a sealed drawer hidden beneath a water tank, he wrote something else entirely. He believed pain had a scent, a weight, a chemical shape that could be moved, not just through the body but into the ground. He claimed that the suffering of the human throat, especially during moments of raw fear or guilt, left a trace behind in the tissue. He called it vocal residue. He believed that if the right part of the body was buried in the right kind of soil, the earth could learn to speak. The patch of soil behind the greenhouse was where he began. He recorded every burial, each one carefully chosen, not entire bodies, just vocal cords, preserved in wax, dipped in root hormones, and placed in the soil with surgical precision. The ashes from Mercy's unclaimed patients were mixed into the dirt, layer by layer, until the ground itself felt soft and unstable, like walking over packed lungs. Over time, thin vines began to grow, not from seeds, but from grafts he inserted into root systems he said were already listening. These vines had no leaves, only tiny pods at the ends, closed at first, round and pale like milk teeth. But when someone walked past the garden, the pods opened slightly. Inside were ridges that looked too much like gums, and at the center of each pod a slit, like a mouth waiting to form its first word. Dr. Meyer charted everything. He played sounds to the garden and measured the vine's movements, low music, laughter, whispers. Nothing changed, until one night he screamed, not out of fear, but by design. A sharp, guttural scream, held as long as his lungs would allow. And one pod bloomed, not slowly, instantly. It opened into a spiral of red petals, soft and wet, that pulsed in rhythm with his voice. He screamed again. Another bloomed. He wrote that it felt like the plants weren't reacting but remembering. Like the sound was something they already knew, something they had once carried inside their own roots. In the weeks before the hospital's closure, the garden grew quickly, outpacing every other patch of land around it. Hospital staff reported odd smells near the greenhouse, metallic and sweet like the inside of a bleeding mouth. Dr. Meyer stopped attending meetings. His office grew darker. One nurse claimed she saw him kneeling in the soil late at night, pressing his ear to the vines like they were confessing secrets. When the building was finally sealed, the garden was left untouched, but during demolition the workers refused to go near it. The earth beneath was still warm, even in winter. And the vines, long dead by then, had left behind hollow stems that, when the wind passed through them just right, made a soft sound. Not music, not wind, a breath, repeating the same sound over and over again, as if trying to finish a sentence it had started inside someone's throat, a sound that should never come from roots. But I did, over and over, until silence returned. It was just past midnight, 2 days before the hospital closed for good. The storm had already begun. Thick sheets of rain, sky cut open by lightning that made the power flicker twice across the west wing. Staff who were still present later claimed they felt something shift in the air just before the lights went dim. A weight not on the body but behind the eyes, as if the building itself was holding its breath. And then, without warning, the 15 doctors of Mercy General, the names scattered through blood-soaked files and unspeakable procedures, walked out, not in panic, not in hiding, but in silence, in line, single file through the west gate that led to the forest trail no longer used, no suitcases, no coats, barefoot, one holding a scalpel, one holding a lantern. Their eyes were sewn shut with surgical thread. There was no announcement, no resignation. Their offices had been left undisturbed. Files still open on desks, surgical trays laid out as if for morning rounds. It was the janitor who saw them first, watching from a basement window as their shadows moved across the rear courtyard. He didn't stop them. He didn't call for help. He simply stepped back and shut the window, too afraid to speak, knowing somehow that whatever they were doing wasn't an escape. It was a ritual, and rituals once begun must not be interrupted. Later, security footage would be pulled from the west gate. The grainy black and white film shows them walking at a steady pace, each doctor perfectly spaced from the next. No one speaks. Their heads do not turn. The one in front holds a scalpel in his right hand, pressed against his chest. The one at the end carries an oil lantern. The flame doesn't flicker, even in the rain. What's most disturbing is the thread. Thick black sutures are sewn into the flesh around their eyes, pulled so tight the lids are folded inward. They did it to themselves. Clean incisions, no swelling, no infection. This wasn't madness. This was preparation. They had blinded themselves to where they believed they were going. Search teams found no trace of them in the woods, no footprints after the edge of the path, no blood, no bodies, just a faint line of burnt grass that ended at a stone marker buried under moss, carved with a symbol found in Klemper's final manuscript, a shape resembling an eye, but with no pupil, a hollow. In the weeks after their disappearance, the hospital fell quiet. Procedures stopped. The remaining staff left with little explanation. Some claimed they were told to go. Others said nothing. By the time the final closure order came down, the building was already empty. But someone long after returned to the chapel. It was a demolition crew that found it. The altar had been shifted. Heavy marble moved inches from its original placement, and on the stone floor beneath it, placed with care in the center of a chalk circle, was a single human eyelid, still stitched closed, still fresh, no blood, no rot, as if it had been offered and not torn. Forensics later confirmed the tissue matched one of the doctors, a match too exact to be random. Whoever left it there wanted it found. As if to say this wasn't abandonment, it was complete. There was no final report, no formal manhunt. The footage was lost in a fire shortly after it was reviewed. But the staff who watched it, those few who stayed behind long enough to see the 15 disappear into the dark, they all agreed on one thing. The doctors weren't fleeing. They weren't hiding. They had done what they came to do. They had heard what they needed to hear. And when there was nothing left in the body, they walked into the storm, blind but certain, as if they knew exactly what waited on the other side. Before the wrecking crews touched the foundation, a team of forensic architects was sent into Mercy General to scan the building. It was standard procedure for a structure that old, to study its weight, its wiring, and to check for weaknesses. But Mercy didn't just give up its rot. It revealed something else. The scans showed irregularities behind the plaster, not decay, not ductwork, but space, long, narrow hollows running like veins through every floor. The architects thought they were looking at structural faults, but when the walls were cut open, what spilt out wasn't air or insulation. It was pieces, fragments, the smallest parts of the forgotten. Inside the cavities, they found teeth, not a few, hundreds. Loose and yellowed, some still with traces of bloodroot, tiny jawbones, clumps of human hair. Fingernails layered like scales, as if they'd been pushed through over time. No full skeletons, no names. Just the leftovers of something done slowly, quietly, and with purpose. The walls weren't hiding bodies, they were storing the parts the world wouldn't notice missing. A tooth from one patient, a rib from another. A lock of hair, a kneecap, a child's molar. Not trophies, not waste. Something else. Arranged, placed, preserved. Forensic teams mapped the distribution and found a pattern. The hollows weren't random. They followed a design. Each cavity curved around major wards, surgical rooms, and basement halls, forming spiral shapes that aligned with no known architectural logic. But when overlaid with lunar cycles from the hospital's operating years, the match was exact. Each filled space corresponded to a phase of the moon. New, waxing, full, waning. It wasn't superstition. It was a calculation. Someone or many had timed the placement of these remains with something celestial. The walls were not just storage, they were part of a ritual machine. Beneath every operating room, symbols were found scorched into the support beams, burnt too deep to have been accidental. Not pentagrams or crosses, these were mathematical. Spirals mirrored numbers and grid lines that looped back into themselves. In one room, directly beneath the pediatric surgery wing, the beam had been carved with a line of numbers that matched the birth dates of children listed in the orphan ledger. Some were backward, some didn't exist at all. The walls in that room were especially thick, lined with over a dozen hollow pockets. Inside one, they found a child's foot mummified and stitched shut at the ankle, wrapped in medical gauze like a gift. Investigators concluded that the building had been hollowed slowly over years. Not for space, but for silence. These were not hidden bodies, they were ingredients. Stored between floors like a second skeleton wrapped around the real one. Mercy General had become more than a hospital. It had become a host, a container for pain, dissected and arranged into a shape that no longer cared for names. One forensic technician later said off record that when they opened the walls, the smell wasn't decay. It was warm, sweet, almost floral, as if the building had been preparing to bloom. A final map of the hospital was drawn based on all the scanned cavities. The layout formed a ring within a ring with the chapel at the center. Around it are 12 major clusters, each matching the path of the moon over a year. Each cluster aligned with a room that had seen the worst. The cold room, the chamber of echoes, the orphan ward. The silence wasn't accidental. It had been built into the walls, into the stone, into the very breath of the place. Mercy General didn't forget what was done inside it. It was memorable, it was recorded. And when the walls came down, what they released was not just history. It was memory, peeled from the bone. In 1974, a thin box arrived at a military archive facility in Virginia. It was stamped with red tape and sealed under 6 federal access codes. Inside was a file long thought lost, or more likely buried on purpose. Its label was plain: Silent Mercy, completed assets, not for civil review. No press release was made, no interviews granted. But within that file were copies of internal memos, letters, and blacked-out testimonies that revealed what Mercy General Hospital truly had been. Not a failed asylum, not a rogue institution, but a quiet partner in a classified wartime program. A sanctioned machine with a purpose no one dared to speak aloud, until now. The operation had been called Silent Mercy, designed by a special unit of psychological warfare researchers during the final months of World War I, and funded by a shadow bureau under the Department of Defense. It was created after traditional methods of interrogation failed to extract useful intelligence from certain prisoners. Individuals captured in Europe and Asia who resisted not through violence, but through silence. These men and women had undergone unknown mental conditioning. Conventional torture produced no results. Drugs made them delusional. But then came a letter from someone the department had already noticed: Dr. Abel Klemper. The correspondence between Klemper and a military science division began in 1916, before Mercy General even opened its West Wing. In the letters, he proposed a method he called non-chemical extraction, a process that bypassed the conscious mind entirely. He explained that through carefully structured procedures involving pain, sound, and sensory deprivation, the human body could be forced to speak not through words but through function. He claimed the nervous system itself could be prompted to confess if placed under the right conditions. No drugs, no restraints, just design. The Pentagon saw potential. By early 1918, Mercy General was fully incorporated into Operation Silent Mercy. The government quietly transferred acquired liabilities, not listed as prisoners of war but as medical test subjects. Their real names were scrubbed, replaced by 4-digit codes. They were flown in at night under the cover of medical emergencies and signed over not to the board, but to Klemper himself. The records list their nationalities, their languages, and what secrets they were believed to hold. But none of them were ever returned to custody, and none of their statements were ever used in court. What they revealed, assuming they revealed anything at all, was never verified. Their confessions were filed, sealed, and ignored. One memo from a military official reads, "Dr. Klemper's work offers no tactical value. His methods are compelling, but the results are impossible to replicate or confirm. The subjects either expire or emerge too psychologically unstable to be debriefed. Recommend termination of partnership." But instead of cutting ties, the operation doubled down. The doctors at Mercy were granted immunity in writing, a full legal shield for all procedures, provided they remained silent and handed over everything they extracted. That immunity extended to the entire staff, including Fontaine, Meyer, and the surgical teams involved in undocumented research. As long as the government received what they called data, the hospital was free to continue. Another letter, unsigned, appears at the bottom of the file. It references something called Doctrine H, believed now to be the same as the hollow doctrine found under the chapel. The author states, "Klemper has moved beyond interrogation. He believes the body itself is housing something we do not yet understand. He's no longer studying truth. He's studying structure." After that, the tone shifts. The final few pages of the file show concern. Not over ethics, but over instability. The doctors had stopped submitting reports. Communications had slowed, and soon after the doctors vanished. 2 days later, the hospital shut its doors. What remains of Operation Silent Mercy is now declassified, but no one has faced trial. The immunity stands. The program was written off as experimental without viable results, and the names of those who were sent there, who were used, tested, broken, were never released. The government insists they were enemy agents, But some of the documents tell a different story. One file lists a 10-year-old child marked emotional resilience extreme. Another file simply reads, speech delay, possibly intentional. I will not cry. These were not all prisoners. Some were just people who didn't fit, people no one would miss, people who were chosen not for what they knew but for what they might reveal if pushed far enough. And now, years later, the silence remains. The doctors are still gone. The building is rubble. The names are dust. But the doctrine, the belief that pain has purpose, that suffering is not just an affliction but a doorway, remains buried in the language of classified files and forgotten rooms. Operation Silent Mercy was never about extracting truth. It was about listening to death long enough to mistake it for revelation. And some listened too closely. Today, Mercy General is gone. The land has been cleared, leveled, and rebuilt into a park that no one visits after dusk. At its center stands a monument, cold, square, and unadorned. No names, no dedication, no mention of the hospital, the staff, or the lives that passed through it. Only a single phrase carved deep into the stone in letters too smooth to be worn by time. Here, the body ends. Nothing more. No explanation. Just silence where memory should live. People walk past it without slowing. Most don't know what was there. The records have been redacted, the testimonies scattered, the doctors vanished, the patient is forgotten. But the silence remains, not in the wind or the earth, but in the shape of what was allowed to happen. Because evil does not wear a mask. It does not arrive in shadow or scream into the night. It walks in daylight, it wears clean coats, it files reports, it adjusts a patient's pillow, speaks softly in the hallway, and calls its work care. And when it cuts precisely, not out of anger but out of belief. Mercy General was never a place of healing. It was a threshold, a line between what we pretend is humane and what we allow in the name of progress. It was not haunted, it was hollow. Filled not with ghosts, but with purpose. So now the question is yours. After everything, after all we've unsealed, the rituals, the scars, the silence, the names scratched into walls, ask yourself, what do you think? Could this happen again? The screen fades, and in the dark that follows, only one sound remains, the slow, steady breath of a woman trying not to remember.